So today's lesson, this is going to be the penultimate lesson. We're going to do one more after this, and then we're going to go right into Acts. This is called Tetelestai. Tetelestai is a Greek word. It is from the Gospel of John. So was anyone here for the John study?
I think.
Okay.
I don't for some of it.
I don't remember when we did the John study, but all right. Well, if you may remember from the John study that I think Tetelestai is the most important word in all of the Bible. I think it is actually the most important word in all of history. I don't think there has ever been a single word, whatever Jesus may have said, the word that St. John records as Tetelestai, I think is the most important word ever said in the entirety of history. So we're going to talk about the death and burial of Jesus today. I'm going to try to keep myself to an hour, but just as a point of reference, for this lesson alone, I read 3 different books, all of which were over 150 pages. Now, I didn't read those books just to prepare this lesson. I read those books for edification, but there are a lot of things that could be written about this. If you want one that I'd recommend, I would say Death on a Friday Afternoon by Father Neuhaus. It's pretty approachable, and I read it when I was, your guys' age for the first time. So, that being said, the review this week is very easy. So last time we, quote-unquote, met online, Pilate tried to get out of condemning Jesus to death because he, didn't really want to kill someone over a religious matter, but he didn't really want to actually save Jesus either. So Jesus did not give him an easy out. So he doesn't want to anger the Jewish leaders, so he condemns Jesus to death via crucifixion after having him scourged, which all but ensured that Jesus was going to die anyway. So we left Jesus right on the road to Golgotha. But before we do that, a couple words on crucifixion, because crucifixion is something that it's very, Sarah's wearing a cross. Anyone else wearing a cross? I have a cross right to the right of me. We have crosses in church all the time. We don't really think of crucifixion anymore because, barring a few countries in the Middle East, no one really crucifies anymore, I think. Yes, the Saudi Arabians do, in fact, still crucify, generally as a post-death humiliation, but it is still sometimes inflicted as a penalty. If you are interested, the word excruciating, meaning painful, literally means out of the cross, crucifix, or ex crux. It is a nightmarish way to die, but for the Romans, even the Romans didn't really like it. When the Roman historian Tacitus writes about Jesus Christ, he refers to it as the extreme penalty. He mentions that there was a Jewish person in Judea who was subject to the extreme penalty by Pontius Pilate. Crucifixion was generally reserved for the worst of criminals, or it was used to send a message. So before Jesus, the largest crucifixion that had taken place was during Spartacus's revolt, where they lined the Appian Way with crucified slaves who had rebelled. After Jesus, it would be the siege of Jerusalem, where the soldiers, just frustrated after a very long siege, they started crucifying out of boredom. It was not something that was done lightly. It was done to send a message and to hurt. And again, it's taken for granted right now. We wear crosses. We worship in buildings with crosses. It's taken for granted Jesus died on a cross. The Messiah dies on a cross, right? That just seems natural. But at the time when Jesus is living, this makes no sense. It's actually one of the strongest evidences that the Bible was not something that was made up, that there was a man named Jesus Christ who was crucified, and that there was something to that his disciples noticed, and it wouldn't be a natural story to tell because it's what's called the Criterion of Shame, and there's a lot of embarrassment that would go along with somebody being crucified. You may remember this from our apologetics lecture. Alexamenos respects his God, and Alexamenos is faithful. This is a graffito. We don't really know when it's from. It's just, you can see there's like a 120-year range. It may be in there. It's found on the Palatine Hill in Rome. But you can see there's a crucified figure. He has a donkey's head. To a pagan, especially to a Roman or a Greek, the Greeks also used crucifixion, though of a slightly different sort. The idea that a god could be crucified was ridiculous. The idea is sometimes mentioned that the Vikings would have been okay with the crucified god because Odin hung himself on a tree for one night. Then not the same thing at all. To die a crucifixion death would be ridiculous. It's insane. Why would God, or any God worth anything, do that to himself? And meanwhile, to the Hebrew mind, you have another problem with God being crucified, with the Messiah being crucified, because whoever hangs on a tree is cursed. How can God become a curse? So this is not something that would have been seen coming. This is not something that would have been planned. If Jesus was trying to fake himself into being the Messiah, which he was not, but if he was, this was the stupidest way to do it. Which is why, we see this evidence in Scripture in hindsight. We see passages like the servant discourse in Isaiah 53, where then we realize what it's referring to. But at the time, it's just kind of a hindsight bias. We've seen the prophecy fulfilled, so we can see it. But at the time, they wouldn't have really been able to think of it or even conjure up the image that this would work somehow. It is, as St. Paul says, to the Jews a stumbling block and to the Greeks foolishness. There were three major methods of crucifixion. We know from the Scriptures that it was not two of these. We know it was not what's called the crux simplex, because the stipes of the cross, which is this part, the vertical part, the stipes would be cemented in. They would not be carried. The crux commissa and the crux immissa would both have what's called a patibulum right here, and that's what you'd carry. An improvised cross. There just aren't, if you've ever been to the Holy Land, there aren't going to be a ton of trees that will work as crosses. This is not the mountains of Pennsylvania or the mountains of Colorado or something. I mean, you don't even need to go to the Holy Land. Just go out into like the plains, like an arid, semi-desert in northern Oklahoma or far southern Oklahoma. You can see the type of scrub that would be available. So we know it's one of these middle two, because we know that Jesus had a sign above his head. There is a reason that most of Christianity uses what's called the crux immissa, or the Latin cross, because it had a sign attached for it, and it's parsimonious. Before we begin with the gospel, now that we've talked a little bit about what crucifixion is and what it is we're about to listen to, kind of to set the scene, quote unquote, it's about 9 a.m. It may be as late as 11 a.m. It is probably about 9 a.m. at this point in time. The priests are on their way. They have to go prepare the sacrifice. After all, this is Good Friday. So Maundy Thursday was the beginning of Passover. Maundy Thursday evening is actually the start of the day of Passover. This is going to be a big day now that they have to go do sacrifices. They have to offer what's called the Hagigah, the festal offering. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and they just want Jesus killed quickly. So that's where we're going to pick up with Jesus. And as I did last couple of sessions, I'm just going to read through the Gospels in harmony, so I'm not going to stop between sources. All the accounts have something different to them. Now as they led him away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon, a Cyrenian, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. And a great multitude of the people followed him, and women who also mourned and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, wombs that never bore, and breasts which never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do these things in the green wood, what will be done in the dry?" There were also two others, criminals, led with him to be put to death. They gave him sour wine mingled with gall to drink, but when he had tasted it, he would not drink. So, remember that Jesus has been scourged. He has probably next to no skin left on his back. There would have been a lot of blood loss, and we have a couple people in here who are pre-med basically, so shock is going to be setting in now. Jesus is not physically in anything like acceptable condition. And they're making him carry his cross. Now, we all know the iconic image. If you've seen The Passion, he carries the full stipes and patibulum. That wouldn't work. Just physically, it wouldn't work. You are dealing with way too much weight there. And also, the wood's a rarity in Judea, so they're going to have those stipes cemented in. They're going to make people carry the patibulum. And we know for a fact that that was what happened. We know people generally were made to carry the patibulum. This is because it's its own form of torture, really. So you have this 125, maybe as light as 75, but probably as heavy as a 125-pound hunk of wood. Your arms are outstretched, and you're bound to it. You are tied to it. Now, as you can imagine, this is not machine-made. This is not balanced super well. And if you're being crucified, you've been scourged at least a little bit, probably a lot. So you are carrying something way too heavy for you, way too imbalanced for you, in a state of physical exhaustion and shock, and your hands are bound to it. So if you fall, you fall. So given what Jesus has gone through physically, it's no surprise he wouldn't have been able to carry the patibulum without help. So it's already a form of torture, and it's being made even worse for Jesus because of what he's already gone through. Simon of Cyrene, he's mentioned in this and in other Gospels. In Mark, we hear that his sons were named Alexander and Rufus. It is traditionally believed that they are all men who converted to Christianity. Because Mark mentions them, it's believed they may have actually gone to Rome and have been a part of the Roman Jewish congregation to which St. Peter would have ministered. Cyrene itself is actually a city in Libya. It has a very strong Jewish community at this time. So Simon is just a Jewish man who's trying to get to the city relatively early in the day, and has the misfortune to be seen by the Romans, and they say, go help him. Jesus is preached to the daughters of Jerusalem. So even in agony, remember what's the first thing he does after he enters in the triumphal entry? It's mourn over Jerusalem, and he knows what's coming. And so even in his agony, almost a week later, 5 days later, Jesus is still mourning over Jerusalem. He still prophesies about what's going to happen in 70 AD. And as he's going to use through a lot of the Passion narrative, he quotes from the Old Testament. He quotes from Tanakh. In this case, he's quoting Hosea, especially Hosea 10:8, basically saying, it would be better if you didn't have kids because of what bad things are going to happen to you. And finally, he's offered wine mixed with gall. Your translation, if you read this at home, may say myrrh. The point is, it's some sort of narcotic. It may have actually even been hemlock, some people think. We're not really sure. The point is that you dull the pain with it. Sour wine or vinegar, it's not like red wine vinegar, if you've ever seen, or white wine vinegar used for cooking. It's more akin to something like kombucha. Or something like that. I mean, it's way more alcoholic than kombucha, but it's a wine that has been allowed to ferment a little bit too much. It's been oxidized a little bit. Doesn't taste very good, but it will get you drunk. And that's what the Romans would be carrying because they're in the heat. They aren't going to be able to carry, the finest Falernian or anything like that. So they just be like, okay, we'll just mix a soldier's drink with him. Some people think that they may have been Jewish people offering Jesus the wine. There is some evidence that the women of Jerusalem would actually give sour wine mixed with narcotic to prisoners so that they didn't suffer too much. But Jesus doesn't drink it because he doesn't, he makes this worse for himself. He doesn't make this better for himself. And at the Last Supper, he even said, after he consecrated the cup and drank from it, he said, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine again until all things have come to pass. So he's fulfilling a prophecy that he made, but there is a practical reason for it as well. He has to suffer and he has to die. Going over to John. And he, bearing his cross, went out to a place called the place of a skull, and which is called in Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him, and 2 others with him, one on either side, and Jesus in the center. Now Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Then many of the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Therefore the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but he said, I am the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts, to each soldier a part, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was without seam, woven from the top in one piece. They said therefore among themselves, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be, that the scripture might be fulfilled, which says, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Therefore the soldiers did these things. Anyone know where that quote in Scripture is from, by the way?
It's a psalm.
It's a psalm. It's Psalm 22. Jesus will quote from 2 psalms during the crucifixion, 22 and 31. If you read Psalm 22, it is a quite graphic description of crucifixion, and it's written almost 1,000 years before Jesus is even born. It's also worth noting that, the accusation can be made about Jesus that, he intentionally fulfilled these prophecies, and sometimes he did. There's nothing wrong with that. Why wouldn't he? But even here, the prophecy is being fulfilled. It's not like he's whispering to them, hey, while I'm hanging up here, if you wouldn't mind dividing my robes, that would be pretty cool. That's not what's happening here. The entire reason this is recorded, especially by John, is because Jesus passively sees the fulfillment of these prophecies. The title, what John in that translation, it's called a title. In Latin, it would be called a titulus. This generally would just be a list of your crimes. So, the people next to him might have had anarchy, thieving, something like that put above their heads. It wasn't really a big deal. It was just more so that you could, crucifixions to send a message. So you walk by, you see why someone's been crucified, and you go, maybe I shouldn't do that. This titulus seems to go a little bit farther. It's written in Hebrew, which is the language, it's the liturgical language. It wouldn't even be a language they spoke necessarily. It would be a language they could read. It would have been written in Aramaic letters, Yeshua HaNatzri, Melech HaYehudim, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. It would have been in Greek and in Latin. So you have, the Greek is the lingua franca. Everyone speaks that. You have Hebrew, so it's there for the Jews. And you have Latin for the people who speak Latin. It is written in literally every language. Pilate seems to have been going above and beyond. And looking at what the Sadducees say to him, it seems a lot more likely that, or it seems at least a little bit likely, rather, that this is kind of Pilate having one last vengeance on the Jewish leaders. Remember, they've been really ticking him off for the last bit of this trial. They've been going out of their way to annoy him. They've been not taking any, in his view at least, they've been not taking any reasonable compromise he's offered them, so he's at least going to have some fun at their expense. And so this actually may be why they go to the cross later. We see the Sadducees at the cross, and it might be that they're just going, well, we wanted him dead and discredited, and it really doesn't help that now the reason we wanted him dead is up there, and this may stir up the same messianic fervor we wanted to avoid. And he quotes Psalm 20, or he fulfills Psalm 22. He will later quote it. Again, he can't do anything to fulfill the prophecy, but God's plan is evident throughout it. Note on crucifixion, again, I'm not trying to be gory, I'm not trying to be gross, but again, we see crosses every day. We don't understand quite what was going on then, whereas Jesus' initial audience, and any initial audience reading this gospel would have had a very graphic understanding. So the nails are basically railroad spikes. They are 6 inches long, at least 3/8 of an inch thick, and they're not put through the palm of the hand because that will tear. They are put through the wrist. The word in Greek is the same. And it's going to hit the sensory motor median nerve, and you're going to cause so much pain it is going to radiate into the chest. Some religious zealots, I guess you could say, still crucify themselves to this day, especially in Latin American countries. And while that's not a good thing for them, it does lead to some interesting medical observation and knowledge that we couldn't otherwise ethically get. And we know that hitting this nerve wouldn't cause severe blood loss, but it would cause a lot of pain, and it would radiate up both arms into the chest. They would crucify themselves because they think it's an act of religious devotion.
The median nerve it's one of only a few nerves that start from the spine all the way through without branching off. And that's why it radiates from one end to the other, whereas you'll have branching off ones that if you nick those, they won't hurt as much, but that median nerve all the way to the spine.
Yeah, and we don't know how much the Romans knew about nerves and stuff, but we do know they knew how to cause pain. And so, yeah, you're hitting a major pain point. So after you're nailed to the patibulum, they use basically crutches to hoist you up and put you onto the stipes. They put your feet one over each other, and again, a nail, single nail, I don't know what nerve they hit. They tended to go towards the ankle,
I
but
don't remember what it's called, but again, it's one of those nerves that go from the spine through the hip all the way down.
yeah, it's a major nerve. So again, no major arteries. It says failing to hit any major nerves. That is not true. I meant veins. You're not hitting any veins or arteries, but you are hitting a major nerve. So it is nothing but agony.
If they hoist him on there while he's nailed to the crossbeam, how do they get it on? Because they always show people, hammering both of the things together.
If to go back a slide, the stipes would probably be something like this. So it would be a little bit narrower, and there'd be a slot, so they could lift it over and then slide it on. Some people think they may have slid it in. We don't know, but either way, it'd be a lot easier to do it this way. This is certainly what contemporary accounts say would happen. Physically, your elbows are positioned so you're not supporting your weight. The nails are supporting your weight, and you can't breathe, and you can't bear your own weight, so you're going to just automatically, it's like trying to hold your breath. If you've ever tried to hold your breath, maybe as a form of protest, you can't. You can't hold your breath forever. You can't kill yourself by holding your breath. Your body fights to breathe and will basically subconsciously adjust you to get you in the best breathing position. And so while you're nailed to a cross, you're trying to do that, but you have a nail in your feet, so you can't breathe properly. You have pain radiating into your chest. You have pain in the major nerves of your body. And ultimately what's going to kill you on the cross is a mix of shock and suffocation. There was a very popular theory back in the 70s that, maybe Jesus was nailed to the cross, but then he faked being dead and they took him off. No. Even people who survived crucifixion, like they got a final stay order or something, would very often die. This is horrifyingly damaging to a body, and you're going to die especially if you're on the cross. You're going to die. The question is just when. It is the worst way to die, I think, that any human has ever figured out how to inflict on another. There's a reason that God sent Jesus at this time to suffer this death. It may not be the most gruesome one, but it is the most physically painful one. And this is also worth noting that this is just general crucifixion. Jesus is a special case because he's already been scourged and beaten. He's sleep deprived. He's suffered severe blood loss. He's probably already in shock, and that's just physically. He's been psychologically and spiritually tortured for hours at this point. Remember Gethsemane. So the physical torture is going to be even worse for Jesus than it is for anyone else. And this is just what we can know he's going through. We can't even fathom the spiritual torture. So this is at 9 a.m. 9 a.m. is the first of it's the morning sacrifice. It's the Korban sacrifice. Korban sacrifice is a sin offering. So Jesus is going to be crucified, and Jesus is going to die at the times of the two daily offerings. And that is not I guess you could say it's a coincidence. Some people certainly want to. I think anyone who would say it's a coincidence is off their rocker. I don't think there's any reason to think this is a coincidence. I think it is very intentional, because Jesus is fulfilling what these sacrifices were designed to remit sin. And what is Jesus doing here? We're about to go through the 7 last words of Jesus. These should hopefully be familiar to you, because hopefully you've all been to a Good Friday service. I am sticking to the traditional order. Technically, we don't know, but this has been the traditional order since the 100s AD. So I see no reason to doubt this. The first word is, "Then Jesus said, 'Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do.'" There's a lot of ways this can be taken. Again, this is something people can write books about, so I'm kind of having trouble, and they have written books about it, so I'm kind of having trouble thinking how to whittle this down or make this simple. When people ask, well, who was Jesus praying for right then? The answer is yes. The answer is yes, Jesus was praying for them. He was praying for the Romans who were crucifying him. He was praying for the Jewish leaders who had made this necessary. He was praying for the nation that made it necessary. He was praying for you and I. And this is really, they know not what they do. Again, people really overcomplicate it. They try to make it a statement about, sins done in ignorance are the only thing he's praying for here. He's only praying for a certain type of sinner, but I really don't think that's true. Because how could they understand what was going on? That's the question. This is God and man dying at the same time. How can God die? We have no idea what's going on. How this even works. We can't even think about the nature of Christ or the Trinity without accidentally creating at least a dozen new heresies every time we try. And how do we understand that God died on a cross? God actually died and rose again. He suffered, we say it every week in the confession, was crucified, dead, and buried. And this is what I referred to at the beginning. This is the climax of all of history. We tend to put religion into this little box. And we're like, okay, well, certainly this would be the climax of redemptive history. But, you want to think about grand historical moments, maybe you'd think of the Civil War, maybe you'd think of World War II, maybe you'd think of Napoleon or Genghis Khan or something, or something else. But in every real way, this is the center point of redemptive history, because this is when, to quote the guy Alfred Edersheim, whose book I use as my primary reference for this series, thus also does the conquered truly conquer his conquerors what their deed had forfeited. So this is when Jesus is asking forgiveness. For us, he's beginning the redemptive work. This is what echoes back in time and makes salvation possible, and this is what echoes forward in time to you and me. This is a quote from that book I talked about, Death on a Friday Afternoon by Father Richard John Neuhaus, and I do think it's worth reading as a book, but I really like this one quote. For whom does he pray forgiveness? For the leaders of his own people, a fragile, frightened establishment that could not abide the threat of the presence of a love so long delayed. For pitiable Pilate, forever wringing his hands, forever soiled. For the soldiers who did the deed, who wielded the whip, who drove the nails, who thrust the spear, it all being but a day's work on foreign assignment, far from home. And for us he asks forgiveness, for we were there. So yeah, it's a simple word, and when you ask the question, who is it for, the answer is yes, it's for everyone. And those who passed by blasphemed him, wagging their heads and saying, "You who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Likewise, the chief priests also, mocking with the scribes and elders, said, "He saved others, himself he cannot save. If he is the King of Israel, let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusted in God, let him deliver him now if he will have him. For he said, I am the Son of God." These are the priests saying this. I mean, they're here to almost certainly affix their own narrative to these events. They're here to basically be like, let's make sure people realize he's a fraud. They're here to try to make this go their way. But this is also this is nauseatingly ignorant. It is satanic in a very real way, and I don't mean that in the melodramatic way, like if you've ever seen The Passion, and it's a good movie, and I'm not meaning to disparage it, but in The Passion of the Christ, they have their very gender, not amorphous, neutral? They have this androgynous-looking Satan who kind of bobs around different parts of the crucifixion. That's not what I mean when I say it's satanic. But if you remember when Satan tempts Jesus, what does he tempt him to do? Turn these rocks into bread. Jump off the top of the temple. God will save you. You're the Messiah. Why won't you do this? They're doing the exact same thing Satan did. Jesus could absolutely walk off the cross at this point. This is almost a temptation, except he's obviously resolved to go through with it, and they're not making a genuine offer. They don't have the power to have it. But this is something that's really satanic, and it's really, again, it's ironic because they're mocking him while he's doing the exact same thing that other Sadducees back in Jerusalem are representing in the temple sacrifice. So it's kind of nauseating, honestly. Back to Luke's account. Then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other, answering, rebuked him, saying, "Do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Amen, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." This is one of those unique accounts. They're actually we have 7 last words of Christ. We have 4 crucifixion accounts. They all have something unique. This is something that only appears in Luke's gospel. And it's because, traditionally at least, it's believed that the centurion at the foot of the cross is one of Luke's sources. Some of the Latins call him Longinus. I believe there are traditions that call him Cassius, but I'm not sure. We don't know his name. But there is a tradition that because at the end of the crucifixion he says this man was the Son of God, that he converted, and that Luke would have been able to track him down 20, 30 years later at the most and get this story. It's interesting also because it almost echoes back to the first word, to Father forgive them. Because when we read historians in contemporary events like Josephus or Tacitus, crucified individuals tend to just basically make nasty jokes. They tend to mock each other. They tend to mock the crowd. They're in excruciating pain, literally, and they're trying to cope with it. And so it's not unusual that this one thief decides to mock Jesus. It's a way for him to distract from his own problems. But it is unique that Jesus actually prays for forgiveness instead of shouting. It would have probably been something powerful to see. In fact, it was powerful to see, because we see that this other thief recognizes it. He recognizes the plain facts of the matter, that Jesus is being murdered by the Jewish leaders who are using the Romans as their tool. So he recognizes that Jesus is innocent, and he recognizes Jesus as Messiah. He may not know what it is he's asking. Here's the thing. People misuse this passage all the time. They're like, okay, well, you don't need to be baptized because the thief on the cross wasn't baptized. You don't need to do X or know X because the thief on the cross didn't know X. The thief on the cross didn't necessarily know who Jesus was. This is a literal deathbed conversion. But he knows that Jesus is the Messiah, and he trusts that Jesus can do something. And what's really interesting is that he doesn't know what it is he's asking, because he probably doesn't know that Jesus is literally God or what that means. But to be fair, the disciples don't know it either. But he has faith that Jesus can do something. And he says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. It's looking into the future. It's saying, you are the Messiah. You have the power to do this. When you fulfill the promises, remember me. And it's interesting that Jesus responds with an immediate response. He says, today you will be with me in paradise. He starts with amen, or verily I say unto you, if you like your King James English. He's saying, truly, today you will be with me in paradise. Again, so much for purgatory, so much for soul sleep. We know John is the only eyewitness to the crucifixion who writes a gospel. John probably doesn't record the thief on the cross because of what's coming next. John has been probably going to gather the faithful women, including his own mother and Jesus' mother. So by the time we reach the end of the thief account, Jesus has probably been crucified between 90 minutes to 2 hours. Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour the disciple took her in his own home. There are a lot of Marys. Miriam was one of the most popular names in first century Judea. We have 3. We have the Virgin Mary. We have Mary, Jesus' mother. And we also have a non-Mary here. We have his sister, who is traditionally known to be Salome, is one of her traditional names. We have Mary, the wife of Clopas. She is either believed to be his uncle or his uncle's wife. She is not his uncle. She is his uncle's wife or his cousin, and Mary Magdalene. So he has family here. And in fact, Mary, the wife of Clopas, is believed to be the mother of James and John, which certainly lends some context to some things. Again, we could talk for a very long time about what this is going to mean for Mary, because this is, if it was a failure for the disciples in Gethsemane to see Jesus being arrested, this is going to be something like 90 times worse to see her son, like the one she was promised by an angel as to be the Messiah, suffering horrifyingly, looking barely like a human being, and at the hands of the Romans dying an objectively cursed death. And so she's going to be in a state. And so what we see here is that, there's a parallel to Jesus all the way back in the temple. Remember, he had to leave Mary and Joseph, or he tried to as a young boy, as a 12-year-old, saying, I must be about my Father's business. And now he's doing the same thing here. He can't fulfill the duties of what would be called in Hebrew the Bechor, the oldest son. He can't take care of her anymore. So he gives her to John. He gives her to family, but he gives her to the disciple who he loves. In fact, if you go to Ephesus today, you can see the home that it is believed the Virgin Mary died in. The church tradition, again, dating back to Clement I. Clement I, he's I believe he's the first pope after Peter. He certainly is an early bishop of Rome. And he himself says that, John took her into his house. He took her with him to Ephesus. She died about 60 AD, something like that. Again, we have his cousins. His cousin's mother is there. We have, Salome is John and James's mother, not Mary, the wife of Clopas. Excuse me. But he's still John is his cousin, so he's still giving his mother to a cousin. And then John disappears from the narrative, and we see that the mother of James and John, Mary of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene stay in the narrative, but Mary, the mother of our Lord, doesn't, which probably means John takes her back to his house immediately, which again makes sense, just with what she would have been psychologically going through. Matthew 27, Now from the 6th hour until the 9th hour there was darkness over all the land. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Some of those who stood there when they heard that said, This man is calling out for Elijah. Immediately one of them ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed, and offered it to him to drink. The rest said, Let him alone. Let us see if Elijah will come to save him. Again, what?
I'm sorry. Why did they think he was calling for Elijah? I mean, I understand, we have the translation of what he said, right under it, but...
Well, we'll get to that in a second, but it's a good question. It's an excellent question, so hold on to that for a second. Just because I want to go, I'm going to answer it, but it's on the PowerPoint, so I can't skip ahead really easily. So first off, the darkness. Again, there are people who, let's say, this was an eclipse. Well, that doesn't work with the Jewish calendar. The Jewish calendar is lunar. It goes by the moon. It could not have been an eclipse. There's one theory that basically says, okay, but if this one thing had happened, maybe it could have been an eclipse. Parsimoniously, God has never allowed any element of Christ's humiliation to pass by without something momentous occurring. If you've ever attended a really high Lutheran worship service, you may have seen this. You can see some of us, we do it here. When you say the creed and you say, and was made man, a lot of people will bow their heads forward. Some people will actually fully touch a knee to the ground. It's called genuflection. That's the beginning of Christ's humiliation, is being incarnated. And a lot of us will keep our heads bowed until he was risen or until the cross. When he was born, what happened? Millions of angels in the sky announcing what's happening right here. When he enters Jerusalem to die, what the voice comes down from heaven, rings out from heaven and says, I have glorified my name and I will glorify it again. At his baptism, the voice says, you are my beloved son, and you I am well pleased. This is supernatural darkness, and I don't think there's anything wrong with acknowledging that. Now to get to your question. With what he says, he's Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. It is Aramaic. It is quoting with the Targum, which is the Aramaic translation of the Tanakh. And it's Psalm 22, verse 1. Some people actually think he may have recited all of Psalm 22, which does begin, my God, why have you forsaken me? It includes verses such as, they have pierced my hands and my feet. My bones are spread out so that I can number them. That people encompass me about. They laugh at me and they scorn me. He may have recited the entire psalm. I don't know. But also it is perfectly rabbinic to quote one verse, and everyone, especially if you're quoting the first verse, people are going to think back and go, oh. And it is, again, 1,000 years before Jesus. Psalm 22 gives us the crucifixion. He's living and dying the text here. He is expressing his absolute abandonment, and he's also answering the accusation. Why won't he get off the cross? Because this is appointed. You read it in the Psalms. This is why I won't get off the cross, because this was appointed for me. He's now been here for about 6 to 8 hours. This is by this point physically, his body is almost at the breaking point, and spiritually he's almost at the breaking point. So we don't know what he said on the cross. He could have said more. We don't know. It's not at all unlikely he didn't say much because of how much absolute pain he was in. But we know that physically he was in torture, and spiritually he was in even more. And this is why I think they mistake him as crying for Elijah. Elihu would be, or at least that's modern Hebrew for Elijah, or one of them, Eliyahu, which could be me mispronouncing. It's been a long day. But it starts with the same words, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, Eli, Eli. They think he's speaking loudly, but he's been through a lot physically, and it's possible that his voice just isn't coming out. It may sound ragged. They may genuinely misunderstand him. But what's also happening, and this is something that, he's not just expressing his suffering and how much he hurts, how much he's in physical pain. Jesus is isolated. This is something we use the phrase that the Father has turned his face away from the Son. There is a severing in the Trinity here. And because I don't want to go into too much detail so I don't actually commit a heresy, I have decided to use a picture. This is not meant as a physical representation of what happened, but it's a picture that at this moment when Jesus cries this out, towards the end of his suffering, he's been on the cross for at least 6 hours. He's basically admitting that, he's severed from the Godhead. Not in the sense that he's no longer God. Obviously, he's still longer God. But the divine presence is God has turned his face away from Jesus. Jesus is suffering the full wrath of God, and he's acknowledging what it is that happens. And I can't explain it to you any better than that, because we don't know. But somehow, on the cross, God turns away from God, and Jesus, as a full man, suffers the full weight of God's wrath, but as God is the only way he can suffer that infinite wrath. So we don't know how it works. It's a mystery. It's a wonderful mystery, but it is a mystery nonetheless. After this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, I thirst. Now a vessel full of sour wine was sitting there, and they filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on hyssop, and put it to his mouth. So when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, It is finished. So remember, he wouldn't take the wine at the beginning. He wouldn't take the drugged wine. But he drinks wine now. Why?
Because it went along with the prophecy.
It did go along with the prophecy.
Because he did what he told his disciples he would do.
He did. It's finished, exactly. He knows that all things are accomplished. In Greek, these two words, knowing that all things were now accomplished and it is finished, these are the same word. They're in different forms because they're in different parts of the sentence, but it's the same root, Tetelestai. All things, he's finished. The debt is paid, and now he's like, I have to fulfill the prophecy. But in addition to fulfilling this prophecy in Psalm 69 and Psalm 22, he even says, I will not drink from the fruit of the vine again until the kingdom of God comes. Well, it's come. The cross is simultaneously humiliation and exaltation. And by going to the cross, Jesus humiliates himself because he suffers the worst death that human beings have ever figured out how to inflict on each other. But it's also glorification because he just won. And now he will drink wine. There's also a physical reason, by the way. If you've ever drunk sour wine, which I have, I can't say I've drunk a historical reenactment of it. I can say that I've left a bottle out too long and not let something go to waste. If you drunk oxidized wine, it will pick you up. If you drunk anything highly acidic like kombucha or something like that, he is reviving himself. And there's a real physiological reason for this. Remember, he wouldn't drink drugged wine because he was going to be alert all the way through. But remember, he'd also said, I lay down my life, I pick it up again. He's not leaving an excuse to say, oh, he just succumbed. He's going to deliberately die. It's offered to him on a sponge of it is offered to him in a sponge on a branch of hyssop. Anyone remember where hyssop may have been mentioned in the Old Testament or anywhere in the Bible?
They had to dip it into the blood and flick it on the people.
Yes, that's one. Is there another one? That is the big one. I'm not. There's another one though, also very relevant, actually tied to what she just said about Egypt. Purge me with hyssop, I will be whiter than snow. Psalm 51. Hyssop, if you boil it and treat it, basically becomes lye. It becomes very, very caustic, relative for the time. So it's when David prays in Psalm 51, purge me with hyssop, he's basically saying, boil me in acid and fix me, because I can't do it myself. But the image here is of forgiveness, redemption, and Passover. So they're telling you it's hyssop. There's a reason for that, especially when others say, oh, they just stuck it on a long stick or they stuck it on a spear. The hyssop is an important detail, and John never does anything accidentally. John is a very intentional gospel writer because he was there. He's the only one who records this last word. And I promised I would talk about Tetelestai because it's my favorite word in the entirety of the New Testament. Tetelestai it can be translated a number of ways. We always think it is finished, but it can be translated, it is consummated, it is fulfilled, it is accomplished, it is perfected, it is paid in full. When a debt was paid, Tetelestai would be written on the bill, paid in full. When a slave was freed, there is evidence saying Tetelestai would be written on their original terms of enslavement because they were freed. The debt was paid. And not to be overly grammatical or to expect that you guys care that much, but I think it's worth talking about here because of the tense. You really have verb tenses the same way in modern English. We are a pretty free language. It's why it's impossible for foreigners to learn it. But in Greek, Tetelestai is what's called the perfect tense. So again, this isn't an accident. Jesus didn't say Tetelestai. Not literally. He wouldn't have spoken Greek. But John chose Tetelestai because it communicates something to us. It is finished, it stands finished, and it always will be finished. The past perfect tense indicates it is done, it will continue to be done, and it will never not be done again. End. Finito. Done. Finished. So everything Jesus has done, all of history up to this point, literally from the instant Adam and Eve bit into that fruit, all the way up to here, summed up in one word. It's done. Finished. I could talk for a very long time about this word. I would probably get very boring. I would talk about grammar. I would get all emotional, and you would be like, why is this long-haired hippie getting emotional over a Greek word? I don't understand it.
How do we know Jesus didn't use that word?
He spoke Aramaic. It would have been much more likely he would have used Aramaic.
Well, you said earlier that everyone in the area kind of knew Greek.
They'd have been able to read it. It was a lingua franca. But especially considering that he says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is Aramaic. It's far more likely he spoke Aramaic. Very few people. I have never read a case made by a theologian that he would have spoken Greek at his death. In fact, I'll tell you in a minute what I think he actually would have said. But before I read, there's a quote from the British theologian Charles Spurgeon that I want to read because I think he does a better job of this, and I won't have to suffer you to me getting all riled up. But there was something said, and it was said at the National Youth Gathering, and I don't want to disparage the National Youth Gathering. A lot of people enjoy it. It's an official synod event. I'm not here to contradict. Well, no, I'm here to contradict it. I'm here to contradict one thing that was said at it. I'm not here to disparage it. And it was said at the last one, all of your sorrow and all of your shame and all of your troubles were nailed to the cross. Wrong. Sin was nailed to the cross. Sin is what's dead here, not your sorrows and your problems and your shame. Because if you remember, that same woman, Salome, and came up, his aunt, came up to him and said, like any good Jewish mother, came up to him with James and John and said, please have my son sit at you on your right hand when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says, can you drink the cup that I drank and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? And they said to him, yes. And he says, then you will indeed drink the cup that I drank, and with the baptism that I am baptized with, you will be baptized. Suffering is going to keep coming. What is killed here is not suffering, it's not sorrow, it's sin. That's all that dies here. But that's really all that needs to die here. So I'll read the Spurgeon quote, and then I'll keep moving on. You don't have to hear me talk about grammar anymore. But the British theologian wrote this in the 1890s. What a grand utterance is Tetelestai. Now we are safe, for salvation is complete. The atonement and propitiation were made once and for all and forever by the one offering made in Jesus' body on the tree. There was the cup. Hell was in it. The Savior drank it. Not a sip and then a pause, not a draught, a single act of drinking and then a ceasing. He drained it till there was not a dreg left for any of his people. Christ has paid the debt which all the torment of eternity could not have paid. Once again, when he said, "It is finished," Jesus had totally destroyed the power of Satan, of sin, and of death. The champion accepted the challenge to do battle for our soul's redemption against all foes. He met sin, horrible, terrible, all but omnipotent sin, nailed him to the cross. But in that deed, Christ nailed sin also to the tree. There they both did hang together, sin and sin's destroyer, sin destroyed by Christ, and by that destruction, Christ destroyed sin. As a matter of interest, 3 options for what Jesus would have actually said. If he spoke Hebrew, if you read a Hebrew New Testament, Jesus' last word is kala, which means it is finished. It also means bride. In Aramaic, he may have said shalim or mashalam. So kala means bride. There's a message there about the church. Shalim is linked to shalom, which means peace. If you read the Peshitta, which is an Aramaic Bible dating at 5th century or earlier, it is still used by almost every sect of Eastern Christianity. They say that he said ho mashalam, either way saying peace is accomplished. We don't know what Jesus actually said. These are just early traditions. And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. Jesus has just died the text. He lived the text, he died the text, literally reenacting both Psalm 22 and 31, or rather embodying. And so he finishes with a quote from Psalm 31:5, but he says the word Father before he quotes it. So he started his suffering with saying, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do." And fulfilling everything, he says, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," which indicates that he's doing it for safekeeping. If you read Matthew's gospel, it actually says he yielded up his spirit. I'm a King James fan just because of the pretty English. It actually says he gave up the ghost, which is a very poetic way of saying it. Then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. So when the centurion and those who were with him, who were guarding Jesus, saw the earthquake and the things that happened, they feared greatly, saying, "Truly, this was the Son of God." And many women who followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, were there looking on from afar, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary and the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. So nature itself, what is the earthquake? Again, we can try to find a reason for it, but in all honesty, the reason is obvious. It's not like Jesus was like, okay, I have to get arrested and die at this time because these 2 fault lines are coming together. It's a physical response from creation itself. If you read the Chronicles of Narnia, when Aslan rises in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis uses the phrase, now that this has been fulfilled, death itself starts working backwards. And we see this even in the book of Romans. The curse that Jesus just undid afflicts earth itself. It's why Jesus has to hit the reset button at the end of days and make a new heavens and a new earth. But even now, the earth react to the curse being undone. The tearing of the temple veil, though, is really interesting because we know from the Talmud that it was actually two veils very close together and pinned together almost. It's about 60 feet long, 20 feet wide, and between 6 to 8 inches thick. So it's, thicker than those couch cushions you're sitting on. And it tears, 60 feet tall, it tears from top to bottom. And this would have happened at about the time of the daily sacrifice. This would have been a cataclysmic event in the Jewish mind, only surpassed by what happens to the temple 40 years later. So it's 3 p.m., and just to kind of get the scene, this is Friday night. This is Friday evening. It's afternoon. What happens on Friday night?
Party.
No, not party. Sabbath. The Sabbath begins. This is the Sabbath of Passover. It is a Sabbath of Sabbaths. They have to get this sacrifice done. People want to go to their homes. Not only are they celebrating a feast, but they're celebrating Sabbath, which is itself a wonderful thing. And so you have this hubbub. You have it was really ritualized by the time of Christ. You actually have you can see them kind of here. You'd have priests waiting to see when it's the right time, and you'd have at least 4 men with shofar trumpets, and then when they get the signal, they blow out a bunch of trumpets. If I were more theatrical, I would bring a shofar. I don't own one, but I'd have had my dad send me his shofar. I'd blow it for you, and I can't do it very well. But you'd be people watching to see this thing done. This is a reenactment of that blood path covenant I keep harping on between God and Abraham, when God walks through that blood twice. Those are the same animals, not literally, but the same species of animals being sacrificed here. They're waiting. It hits 3 p.m. They're blowing the trumpets, and that's when Jesus dies. He says, "It is finished, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." At this same time, so there's an earthquake. At this same time of the sacrifice, Caiaphas is in the holy place. Remember, there's the holy place, and then there's the Holy of Holies, and you go into the Holy of Holies on one day of the year, Yom Kippur. Other than that, you offer evening incense to it. And he's right in front of this, and this massive veil tears right from the top. No human could do this. No earthquake could do this. This is not, again, The Passion's a good movie, but it just shows kind of, the earthquake broke this tiny little shower curtain we're showing you. No, it wasn't a shower curtain. It tears from top to bottom from the hand of God itself. And keep in mind, there's no Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies anymore. God just revealed, what was in the Holy of Holies? What dwelt on top of the Ark of the Covenant? God. Anyone remember what that's called?
Yahweh?
No, well, that's the name of God. There's a word that I think I've complained before about how Gentiles pronounce it.
The Shake, whatever.
Shekinah was how Gentiles pronounce it. Shekinah is the proper, but everyone's like, it's the Shekinah glory. It's a word that never appears in the Bible. It's rabbinic. It means dwelling place. The Shekinah is not there. There's no Ark of the Covenant there. If the Shekinah is the dwelling place, and it means dwelling, it means living with, it means settling. Where is the Shekinah right now when God has ripped the curtain open for the Holy of Holies? What's he saying with this? What's the picture here?
It's with you?
Not with you. I mean, it's kind of with you.
Well, it's me. God.
No.
Jesus?
Technically the answer, yes. The Shekinah just died on a cross. On Golgotha, inside of the city. If you go now, the Jerusalem geography has changed a lot, but if you go to Golgotha, if you went to Golgotha today, what we believe is Golgotha, you could see the Temple Mount. In sight of the temple itself, Jesus, the very Son of God, the Shekinah, the Word that became flesh and dwelt among them, is dead and is on a cross, and they killed him. Whew, boy. I said I could get through this in an hour. I may have been over-exaggerating. All right, we're going to rush through. Therefore, because it was the preparation, the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day. The Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who was crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you may believe. For these things were done that the scripture should be fulfilled. Not one of his bones shall be broken. And again another scripture says, they shall look on him whom they have pierced. So really quickly, leg breaking, it's if you really want to be a jerk and just kind of hasten it, they can't support their weight at all. They suffocate more quickly. If you're going to kill them immediately, it's okay, but at least we'll give you some pain before we stab you. They stab Jesus even though they don't break his shins or his thighs. The blood and water, much is made of this that's miraculous. Personally, I think it's just pericardial fluid. They'd have stabbed him in the heart. He died, he died of physical trauma, but he laid down his life. But there is something not miraculous, but symbolic here, blood and water. But what's the nauseating thing here is that they want him off the cross because they want to keep the Sabbath. They just killed the Son of God. Their temple has just been rocked by an earthquake. The Shekinah has been shown to be absent, and they're like, but the Sabbath, though. It is the irony is nauseating, but we'll keep rushing through. We'll be like 2 minutes over. I apologize, but I want to get this finished. Now, when evening had come, because it was the preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent council member who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, coming and taking courage, went in to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate marveled that he was already dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him if he had been dead for some time. So when he found out from the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. And Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds. Then they took the body of Jesus and bound it in strips of linen with the spices, as the custom of the Jews is to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So there they laid Jesus because of the Jews' preparation day, for the tomb was nearby. And the women who had come with him from Galilee followed after, and they observed the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and fragrant oils, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. So we've seen, the death has done something here. We've seen that, two Sanhedrin members, Joseph and Nicodemus, obviously ones who didn't consent to his death, even though he's dead, they publicly declare allegiance. This is not a political move that's going to be good on their part. They make his grave with the rich. But I think the most interesting thing here, what day is it? When Jesus takes his Sabbath rest. When he's done this before. This is a new creation. There's a moment in the Passion of the Christ movie where they have Jesus quote the book of Revelation, and we don't know if he said it, but the treatment is very good, where Mary sees him carrying the cross, and he says, "Behold, Mother, I make all things new." And that's what he's doing here. He's undoing that creation story. He's fulfilling every major covenant that's been made. He's fulfilled the Adamic covenant because he's kept the law that Adam couldn't keep. He's fulfilling the Abrahamic covenants because all nations will be blessed in him. He's fulfilled the Mosaic covenant because he's become the Paschal Lamb, and he's become the Shekinah that is the dwelling of God among his people. And he said to Tetelestai, it's done, he's ended his work, and now he's going to take a Sabbath rest. There are no accidental parallels in Scripture. I could have talked about this for quite literally hours more, but I think we should just call it a day. So I will end right here.